The first thing I noticed about Meera Callahan was that she did not blink when the training drone exploded 3 feet from her head. It happened on the very first day of advanced tactics, before anyone even knew her name. A maintenance drone above the sparring ring lost power and dropped straight down, sparking and hissing, landing so close to her boots that sparks touched the hem of her uniform. Every student in that room flinched. Some of us screamed. One boy from the Threll cluster actually fell out of his chair trying to get away. Meera just looked down at the smoking drone, tilted her head slightly and said, "That needs a new coil." Then she looked back up at the instructor as if nothing had happened at all. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, that something about this girl was different in a way I did not have words for yet. Not strange in the way new students are usually strange. Not nervous, not eager to impress, not trying to prove she belonged. She simply sat there, calm as still water, while the rest of us were still catching our breath. My name is Leo Sanders. I was 17 years old that year, enrolled at the Coalition Academy on Station Perimeter 9, training alongside students from 11 different worlds. Most of us were there because our families had connections, or because our species valued combat training as a mark of status. Humans were rare at the Academy, rare enough that when one enrolled, people noticed. Earth had only joined the wider galactic community a few years before I started at the Academy. Before that, most species barely knew humans existed. After first contact, though, something strange started happening. Traders who visited Earth came back with odd stories. Scientists who studied human biology filed reports that other species found difficult to believe. Slowly, a new word began to spread through Academy hallways and starport bars alike. Deathworlder. It was not exactly a compliment, and it was not exactly an insult either. It was closer to a warning label, whispered with a mixture of respect and unease. Earth, it turned out, was not a gentle place. It was not the paradise garden world that most advanced species preferred to evolve on. It was a planet of crushing gravity, unpredictable weather, apex predators on every continent, and a history so violent that other species studying it in academic journals often used words like impossible and how are they still alive. Humans, the reports said, were survivors of one of the most dangerous environments known to have produced intelligent life. And somehow, despite all of that, they had also produced art, music, medicine, and diplomacy. It confused a lot of people. It confused me too, honestly, right up until Meera sat down 2 rows in front of me and calmly identified a malfunctioning drone by the sound of its dying engine. She was not what I expected. I think most of us in that classroom had built up some picture in our heads of what a Deathworlder would look like. Something intimidating, something with the kind of presence that fills a doorway before the person does. Meera was none of that. She was of average height for a human girl her age, with light brown hair pulled back in a simple braid, and quiet gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around her without ever looking rushed. She wore her uniform the same way everyone else did. She carried her books the same way. If you passed her in the hallway without knowing anything about her, you would think she was completely ordinary. It was only when you watched her closely, the way I found myself doing more and more that first week, that you noticed the small things. The way she never seemed surprised by loud noises. The way her shoulders never tensed up during simulated emergency drills the way everyone else's did. The way she ate her meals in the dining hall, with the same unhurried calm whether the room was quiet or filled with shouting cadets celebrating a sports victory. I remember asking her about it once, early on, during a lull between classes. We were both assigned to the same study group for orbital mechanics, and I had worked up the nerve to ask something that had been bothering me for days. "Doesn't anything scare you?" I asked. She looked up from her notes and considered the question seriously, the way she seemed to consider everything. "Plenty of things scare me," she said. "I just don't see the point in showing it before I have to." I did not fully understand what she meant by that at the time. It would take weeks before I did. The Academy itself sat in high orbit above a quiet trade world, a massive structure of interlocking rings and training halls built to accommodate the very different needs of a dozen species at once. Some hallways had low gravity for students from lighter worlds. Some classrooms had adjustable atmospheres. It was, in its own strange way, a peaceful place, built on the idea that if young people from different worlds trained together, grew up together, and competed together, the galaxy itself would become a little less likely to tear itself apart in the future. That was the theory anyway. In practice, old grudges and old prejudices had a way of following students through the academy doors, no matter how carefully the administrators tried to keep them out. One of the students who carried the heaviest grudge that year was a boy named Dravith Kor. Dravith came from a warrior lineage on a world called Ashkar, a place where combat skill determined social standing from the moment a child could walk. His family had sent 5 generations of students to the Coalition Academy, and every single one of them had graduated near the top of their combat class. Dravith intended to be the 6th. He was tall, even by Ashkari standards, with pale gray skin marked by ceremonial scars that his family had given him as a child to mark his bloodline. He moved through the academy hallways like he already owned them, trailed by 2 or 3 students who seemed to exist mainly to laugh at his jokes and repeat his opinions back to him as if they were their own. For the first 2 weeks of the term, Dravith barely acknowledged that Meera existed. She was, in his eyes, simply another minor species student, filling a seat that could have gone to someone more deserving. It was only after the first combat evaluation that his attention shifted toward her, and once it did, it never really left. The evaluation was simple by academy standards. Students were paired off for basic defensive drills, nothing dangerous, just enough contact to measure reaction time, balance, and control. Dravith was paired against a smaller student from a species built for speed rather than strength, and he dominated the match easily, the way he dominated most matches. Meera was paired against a boy twice her size from a heavy-gravity world, someone the instructors clearly expected to overwhelm her through sheer mass alone. She won in under 6 seconds. I was standing close enough to see it happen, and even now I have trouble describing exactly what she did. There was no wasted movement, no dramatic display. She simply read where the larger boy was going to step before he stepped there, adjusted her own position by a few inches, and used his own forward momentum to put him on the mat. He was more surprised than hurt. The entire exchange looked less like a fight and more like a dance, where only one person knew the steps. The instructor, an older Vakari woman named Instructor Velen, made a small note on her datapad and moved on to the next pairing without much comment. But I noticed Dravith watching from across the room, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. After that day, something shifted in the way he looked at Meera. It was not open hostility, not yet. It was something quieter, and in hindsight, more dangerous. It was the look of someone recalculating their own place in the world and not liking the new numbers. I did not think much of it at the time. Rivalries were common at the academy. Students pushed each other, competed with each other, occasionally resented each other. It seemed, on the surface, like a normal part of growing up, surrounded by the most competitive young people from a dozen worlds. I had no idea, sitting in that classroom during the second week of term, just how far that quiet resentment would eventually travel, or how close I would come to watching someone get seriously hurt because of it. All I knew, in that moment, was that Meera Callahan had won her match without raising her voice, without breaking a sweat, and without once losing that same calm expression she wore when the drone exploded next to her on the very first day. She simply nodded to her opponent, helped him up off the mat, and walked back to her seat as if she had just finished a light warm-up rather than a combat evaluation. I remember thinking, watching her sit back down and quietly return to her notes, that there was something almost unsettling about how little effort the whole thing seemed to cost her. Not because she looked dangerous. She didn't. She looked exactly the same as she had 5 minutes earlier. That, I would come to understand, was precisely the point. By the third week of term, the whispers about Meera had spread well beyond our classroom. It started small, the way rumors always do. Someone in the dining hall mentioned that a human girl had thrown a heavy-gravity student across the mat without breaking a sweat. Someone else added that she had done it in under 10 seconds. By the time the story reached the younger cadets in the lower rings of the academy, it had grown into something closer to legend, the details stretched and reshaped with every retelling. Meera herself seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. She kept to herself between classes, spent most of her free time in the study hall or the quiet observation deck that looked out over the trade world below, and never once brought up the evaluation match unless someone else mentioned it first. If anything, the attention seemed to make her uncomfortable in a way that combat never did. Draveth Kaur, on the other hand, could not let it go. I noticed it first in small ways. He started arriving early to shared classes, always choosing a seat where he could watch her without being obvious about it. He began asking pointed questions during lectures, questions clearly designed to make human biology sound weak or inferior, hoping, I think, to draw some kind of reaction out of her in front of the class. "Isn't it true," he asked during one lecture on species physiology, directing the question at our instructor, but staring directly at Meera, that humans have among the weakest bite force of any sentient species, catalogued by the coalition? Weaker jaw muscles than a domesticated threll pet? The instructor, a patient older Zen scholar who clearly recognized what Draveth was trying to do, answered the question factually and moved on without giving him the reaction he wanted. Meera did not even look up from her notes. It happened again a few days later, this time framed as a question about human reflexes compared to Ashkari reflexes, and again a few days after that, framed as a question about human tolerance for pain. Each time, Meera remained perfectly still, perfectly polite, answering only when directly addressed, and never once taking the bait. I began to notice that her calm seemed to frustrate Draveth more than any argument could have. It was as if he wanted her to defend herself, to get angry, to prove that she felt threatened by him in some way, and her refusal to do any of that left him with nowhere to direct his frustration except further escalation. The turning point came during a squad exercise in the lower training ring, an activity meant to build cooperation between students who would eventually need to work together in mixed crews. Squads were assigned randomly that week, and through pure bad luck, or perhaps not entirely by chance given how Draveth's family influence tended to work within the Academy's administrative systems, Meera and Draveth ended up on the same team. The exercise itself was simple. Each squad had to navigate a simulated cargo hold filled with obstacles, using teamwork and communication to reach an objective marker on the far side within a set time limit. It was meant to test coordination, not combat skill. From the very beginning, Draveth made it clear that he did not intend to follow Meera's suggestions, even when they were objectively the better strategy. When she suggested the team split into 2 groups to cover more ground efficiently, he overruled her and ordered everyone to stay together, wasting valuable time. When she pointed out a faster route through a maintenance shaft, he insisted on taking the longer path instead, apparently unwilling to be seen following instructions from her. Our squad finished the exercise in last place that day, and it was obvious to everyone watching, including the instructors, exactly why. What happened afterward, in the equipment room while the rest of the squad filed out, was something I only witnessed because I had lingered behind to retrieve a dropped data pad. Draveth cornered Meera near the storage lockers, his 2 usual companions hovering nearby, clearly there to witness whatever he intended to say. His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the sharp edge underneath it. "You think you're better than the rest of us," he said. It was not a question. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Meera answered evenly. "I think we lost points today because you wouldn't listen to a faster route." "I don't take direction from a soft-skinned minor species survivor," Draveth said. "Your planet is a footnote in the Coalition archives, a dangerous rock that happened to produce something that could hold a knife eventually. That doesn't make you special. It makes you an accident." I expected, honestly, some kind of reaction from her. A flash of anger, a sharp retort, something. Instead, Meera simply looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than hurt. "You're right that Earth is dangerous," she said finally. "You have no idea how right you are. But calling us an accident isn't going to make that less true." Then she picked up her bag and walked past him, past his companions, and out of the equipment room without another word, leaving Dravith standing there, with his fists clenched at his sides and nothing left to say. I did not tell anyone what I had seen that day, partly because I was not entirely sure what I had witnessed, and partly because Meera herself never mentioned it again. She showed up to class the next morning exactly as calm as always, greeted our study group with her usual quiet politeness, and worked through her orbital mechanics problems as if the confrontation in the equipment room had never happened. But something had changed in Dravith. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened whenever she answered a question correctly in class. I could see it in the way his usual circle of friends had grown quieter around him, as if even they had started to sense that something inside him was pulling tighter with every passing day, like a spring being wound past the point it was designed to hold. The Academy held a midterm combat exhibition a week later, an event where selected students demonstrated techniques in front of the entire training division, including visiting instructors from partner academies across the sector. It was considered a significant honor to be chosen, and Dravith had been selected every single term since his enrollment, a fact his family made sure the entire academy knew. This term, for the first time, Meera was selected alongside him. I remember the exhibition hall being nearly full that day, students packed into the observation tiers, instructors seated along the front row with their data pads ready to score each demonstration. Dravith went first, performing a sequence of traditional Ashkari combat forms with the kind of precision that came from years of dedicated training. It was genuinely impressive. Even I had to admit that, watching from the upper tier with the rest of my squad. Then it was Meera's turn. She was paired against a senior instructor for her demonstration, a formality meant to showcase defensive technique against a skilled opponent rather than another student. What followed was unlike anything most of us had seen before. There was nothing flashy about her movements, no dramatic flourishes, no wasted energy. Every motion seemed to exist for exactly one purpose, and once that purpose was achieved, the motion stopped. She read the instructor's attacks before they fully committed, redirected force rather than opposing it directly, and ended the demonstration with the instructor genuinely caught off guard, something none of us had ever seen happen during an exhibition match. The applause afterward was polite but subdued, the kind of applause that comes from an audience still processing what they just watched, rather than one that fully understood it yet. Dravith did not applaud at all. I found myself sitting near him during the closing remarks, close enough to see his expression as the head instructor praised both demonstrations, careful and diplomatic in giving equal credit to each student. Dravith's face remained perfectly still, but his hands, resting on his knees, were pressed flat with enough force that his knuckles had turned pale. It was the first time I truly understood that something inside him had shifted from resentment into something closer to obsession, though I did not yet have the words to name exactly what that meant, or how close we were to finding out. The lesson that changed everything was supposed to be about talking, not fighting. Instructor Valen had scheduled a unit on threat de-escalation, part of the Academy's broader curriculum on conflict resolution between species. The idea behind it was simple. Not every dangerous situation in the field would call for combat skill. Sometimes the most valuable ability a cadet could have was knowing how to read a hostile situation and diffuse it before it became violent at all. I remember thinking, when I first saw the lesson listed on our schedule, that it seemed like a strange subject to teach at a combat academy. It made more sense to me once Instructor Valen explained her reasoning on the first day of the unit. "Anyone can learn to throw a punch," she said, standing at the front of the classroom with her hands folded behind her back. "Very few of you will ever learn to prevent one from being necessary in the first place." That skill will save more lives over your career than anything you learn on the sparring mat. The unit ran for most of that week, covering body language, tone of voice, and the early warning signs that a situation was escalating toward violence. It was, by Academy standards, a quiet and thoughtful set of lessons, filled with case studies and calm discussion rather than physical drills. I did not expect it to be the setting for the most frightening thing I would witness during my entire time at the Academy. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, during a portion of the lesson focused on reading physical tells before an attack. Instructor Valen had set up a demonstration area at the front of the room, a simple open space where she planned to walk students through common warning signs using slow, controlled examples. She had called on several students throughout the week to help demonstrate different scenarios, always in a calm, supervised way, always with clear boundaries about what was and was not part of the exercise. That day, she called on Dravith to help demonstrate what an agitated posture looked like compared to a relaxed one, and she called on Meera to stand across from him as the observer, someone whose job was simply to identify the warning signs out loud for the rest of the class. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease when I heard the pairing, though I could not have told you exactly why at the time. Something about putting those two particular students in the same demonstration space felt wrong in a way I did not have the language for yet. The exercise began normally enough. Dravith stood in the open space at the front of the room, and Instructor Valen walked the class through the difference between his neutral posture and a tense one, asking him to shift between the two so students could observe the subtle changes in his shoulders, his weight distribution, the set of his jaw. Meera stood a few feet away, watching quietly, occasionally offering a calm observation when the instructor asked for one. Her voice was steady and professional the entire time, the same tone she used when answering questions in orbital mechanics. It was somewhere around the third or fourth demonstration cycle that something shifted. I was watching from the second row, close enough to see it happen but far enough that I had no chance of doing anything about it, and even now, thinking back on it, I am not entirely sure what triggered the change. Maybe it was something Meera said, something the instructor asked her to point out about Dravith's posture. Maybe it was simply weeks of pressure finally reaching a point his pride could no longer contain. Whatever the reason, Dravith's expression changed in an instant. The careful, controlled posture he had been demonstrating for the class dissolved into something real, something the exercise was never supposed to produce. His hand moved toward the inside of his uniform jacket with a speed that startled the entire room into silence. What came out of his sleeve was a compact folding blade, the kind that was strictly forbidden anywhere on Academy grounds, the kind that should never have made it through the entrance scanners in the first place. Later, we would learn he had smuggled it in through a maintenance access point his family connections had helped arrange, carrying it for weeks, waiting, though none of us understood yet exactly what he had been waiting for. The room erupted into chaos in the space of a single heartbeat. Someone screamed. Chairs scraped backward as students scrambled away from the demonstration area. Instructor Valen took a sharp step forward, her hand already reaching for the emergency alert panel on the wall, her voice cutting through the noise with a command to stop that came half a second too late. Dravith moved toward Meera with the blade extended, his face twisted into an expression I had never seen on him before, something raw and unguarded that stripped away every careful layer of composure his family training had built over years. And Meera smiled. I want to be careful about how I describe that smile because it has stayed with me ever since, replayed in my memory more times than I can count, and I have never quite found the right words for it. It was not a cruel smile. It was not a frightened one either. It was closer to the expression of someone recognizing a familiar pattern, something she had seen coming from a long way off, and had simply been waiting to arrive. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe it. Dravith's attack was fast by Academy standards, fast enough that most students in that room would not have had time to react at all, but it was also, I would later understand, telegraphed in almost every way that mattered. His shoulder dropped before his arm moved. His weight shifted forward too early. His grip on the blade was tight with anger, rather than controlled with intent, the kind of grip that sacrifices precision for raw emotion. Meera read all of it in an instant. She did not step backward, which surprised everyone watching, myself included. Instead, she stepped slightly to the side and forward, closing the distance rather than retreating from it, her hand catching his wrist at the exact moment his arm was fully extended and least able to change direction. There was a small, sharp motion, more of a redirection than a strike, using his own forward momentum against the angle of his elbow. The blade clattered to the floor. Dravith's arm bent at an angle his body had not chosen for itself, and he found himself turned, off balance, his back against Meera's shoulder, his momentum completely absorbed and redirected in a way that left him standing but entirely unable to continue whatever he had intended to do next. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It felt, to everyone watching, like it stretched out much longer than that. The room fell into a silence more complete than anything I had experienced at the academy before or since. Instructor Valen stood frozen halfway across the room, her hand still hovering over the alert panel, clearly caught between finishing the emergency call and processing what she had just watched happen in front of 30 witnesses. Meera released Dravith's arm with the same calm efficiency she had used to catch it, stepping back to give him space, her expression settling back into the same quiet neutrality she wore during ordinary class discussions. Dravith stumbled backward, clutching his wrist, his face a mixture of shock, humiliation, and something that looked almost like relief, as if some part of him understood that things could have gone very differently. For a long moment, nobody in that classroom moved, nobody spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ventilation system and the ragged breathing of 30 terrified cadets trying to process what they had just witnessed. Then Meera did something that none of us expected, something that would end up defining the rest of that term in ways I could not have predicted in that frozen, silent moment. She bent down, picked up the folded blade from the floor with careful, practiced hands, and set it on the instructor's demonstration table. Then she turned back to face the class, and in the same calm, steady voice she used for every ordinary lesson, she said the words that none of us would ever forget. This is actually a perfect example of what we've been discussing all week. Does anyone want to walk through what just happened, or should I? Nobody answered her question. 30 students sat frozen in their seats, and even Instructor Valen, a woman who had spent decades teaching cadets from a dozen different worlds, seemed momentarily unable to find the right words for what she had just witnessed. Meera did not seem bothered by the silence. She simply turned toward the demonstration area, glanced down at the folded blade resting on the table, and continued speaking as if she were finishing a thought rather than starting a new one. Most attacks that succeed against a trained defender happen because of hesitation, not because the attacker was faster or stronger, she said. The person defending waits too long to believe what they're seeing. They spend half a second thinking, that can't actually be happening, and that half a second is usually the difference between walking away and not walking away. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of a few students who had clearly not expected to be part of this conversation. Her tone stayed exactly the same as it had been during every ordinary lesson that term. Steady, patient, almost gentle. "What you all just saw is what a real telegraph looks like," she continued. "Watch the shoulder drop, the way it happened before anything else moved. Watch the weight shift forward too early. That's the body trying to build momentum before the mind has finished deciding. It's honest information, if you know how to read it. It tells you exactly where the attack is going before the attacker fully understands it themselves." A few students had begun leaning forward slightly, drawn in despite the fear still evident on most of their faces. I understood why. There was something almost hypnotic about the way she explained it, the way she took the most frightening moment any of us had ever experienced in a classroom and turned it into something that suddenly made sense, something with rules and patterns instead of chaos. Instructor Valen finally found her voice, though it came out quieter than her usual classroom tone. "Cadet Callahan," she said carefully, "perhaps we should pause and address the situation directly, before continuing the lesson. "Of course," Meera said, immediately deferential, the calm authority in her voice shifting back into the posture of a student rather than a teacher. "I only meant that it seemed like a shame to waste the example, given that everyone was already watching so closely." There was something almost darkly humorous about that statement, and I noticed a few students near the back of the room let out shaky, disbelieving laughs, the kind that come from nerves finally cracking after too much tension. Instructor Valen moved quickly after that, calling for security to escort Dravith to the medical wing to have his wrist examined, and then to the administrative office to await formal review. 2 staff members arrived within minutes, and Dravith left the classroom without meeting anyone's eyes, his usual confident posture replaced by something smaller and more hollow than any of us had ever seen from him. The rest of that class period passed in a strange, quiet haze. Instructor Valen dismissed us early, her own composure clearly still shaken despite her best efforts to maintain professional calm in front of her students. Most cadets filed out of the room in near silence, exchanging glances rather than words, as if none of us quite trusted our own voices yet. I stayed behind for a moment, unsure why exactly, and found myself standing near Meera as she gathered her things from her desk with the same unhurried care she brought to everything else. "Are you all right?" I asked, and even as the words left my mouth, I realized how strange the question sounded, given what I had just watched her do. She looked up at me, and for just a moment, something flickered behind her calm expression, something tired and human in a way that reminded me she was 17 years old, just like the rest of us, no matter how differently she carried herself. "I'm fine," she said. "I've had worse days." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing at all, and she gave me a small, tired smile before slinging her bag over her shoulder and walking out of the classroom, leaving me standing there, trying to process everything I had just witnessed. The formal review took place 2 days later, conducted by a panel that included Instructor Valen, the Academy's head of discipline, and a representative from the Ashkari consulate, since Dravith's family status meant his case could not simply be handled through ordinary Academy procedure. I was not present for the review itself, but the details spread through the Academy quickly enough over the following days, pieced together from staff comments and second-hand accounts, until most of us had a fairly clear picture of what had been decided. Dravith was suspended from combat training for the remainder of the term, a significant blow to a student whose entire Academy career had been built around combat performance. He was required to complete a formal counseling program focused on conflict management, and his family was formally notified of the incident, a fact that reportedly caused far more distress to Dravith than the suspension itself, given how much weight his family placed on Academy reputation. More surprising to most of us was the decision regarding Meera. Some students had quietly worried that she might face disciplinary consequences of her own, given how forcefully she had responded, even in self-defense. Instead, the review panel concluded that her response had been proportionate, controlled, and entirely within the bounds of reasonable self-defense, a fact that Instructor Valen apparently emphasized strongly during the proceedings, having witnessed the entire incident firsthand. What surprised me most, though, was learning that Meera had also requested, during her portion of the review, that Dravith's suspension be limited rather than permanent. According to the account that eventually reached me through my study group, she had told the panel that permanently ending his combat training career over a single moment of loss of control, however serious, would not actually address the underlying problem and might simply create a young man with even less structure and even more resentment. "He needs to learn," she reportedly said, "not to be erased." I did not know what to make of that at the time. Some students thought it was remarkably generous of her. Others thought it was almost unsettling, further proof that she operated by a set of instincts none of us fully understood. Looking back on it now, I think it was simply consistent with everything else I had observed about her since the very first day, when she looked at a smoking, sparking drone inches from her face and calmly diagnosed the mechanical problem instead of panicking. She did not see the world in terms of threats to be destroyed. She saw it in terms of problems to be solved, calmly, efficiently, and with as little unnecessary damage as possible. It was, I would come to realize, the exact same instinct that had allowed her to disarm Dravith in under 2 seconds without seriously hurting him, despite having every opportunity to do so. That instinct, more than the speed of her reflexes or the precision of her technique, was the thing that truly separated her from the rest of us, and it was the thing that took the rest of the Academy far longer to understand than it should have. The weeks that followed the incident changed the Academy in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Dravith returned to general classes after his suspension from combat training, though he was noticeably quieter than before, his usual circle of companions thinner than it had been at the start of the term. I passed him in the hallway a few times during those weeks, and each time he seemed to be carrying something heavier than the loss of status alone could explain, something closer to genuine reflection than simple embarrassment. I spoke with him only once during that period, an awkward conversation in the equipment room that neither of us seemed fully prepared for. He was returning a set of training gear, and I happened to be there collecting my own, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. "I keep thinking about what she said," he finally told me, not quite meeting my eyes, "about not being erased. I don't understand why she would say that, after what I did." I did not have a good answer for him, so I simply told him what I had come to believe myself over the previous weeks. "I don't think she was trying to protect you," I said. "I think she was trying to make sure you actually learned something from it, instead of just disappearing into shame and coming out the other side, even angrier than before." He was quiet for a long moment after that, turning the words over the way I imagined he had been turning over everything else that had happened to him since that Thursday afternoon. "She could have really hurt me," he said eventually. "Everyone keeps saying that, and I keep replaying it, and every time I do, I understand a little more clearly just how much control she must have had over that moment. She wasn't even trying hard. I could see it in her face. It barely registered as a real threat to her at all." That observation stayed with me long after our conversation ended, in part because I had noticed the exact same thing myself, watching from the second row that day, though I had not yet found the words to describe it as clearly as he just had. Meera, meanwhile, seemed almost entirely unaffected by her sudden shift in reputation, at least on the surface. She continued attending her classes with the same quiet focus, completed her assignments with the same careful attention to detail, and generally behaved as though the entire incident had simply been another item on an ordinary school day, rather than the most talked-about event the Academy had seen in years. What did change, gradually and noticeably, was the way other students treated her. Before the incident, most cadets had regarded her with a kind of distant curiosity, the same way you might regard an unfamiliar animal at a zoo enclosure, interesting to observe, but not something you expected to interact with directly. After the incident, that distance began to close, though not in the way I initially expected. I had assumed, in the days immediately following, that students would become more cautious around her, more careful, perhaps even more afraid. Instead, something closer to the opposite happened. Students began seeking her out, not out of fear, but out of a kind of quiet respect that seemed to grow stronger the more people learned about what had actually happened in that classroom. A group of younger cadets from the lower training ring began requesting her as a study partner for their own tactics classes, hoping to absorb even a fraction of the instinct that had allowed her to read Dravith's attack before it fully began. Instructor Valen herself started incorporating aspects of the incident into her official curriculum, using it, with Meera's permission, as a genuine case study in threat recognition for future terms. Even some of Dravith's former companions, the students who had once trailed behind him laughing at his jokes, began drifting toward Meera's study group in the weeks that followed, drawn less by fear and more by a growing understanding that whatever she carried inside her, that unshakable calm that had unsettled so many of us at first, was something worth learning from rather than something to avoid. I found myself thinking during those weeks about all the stories I had heard about Earth before Meera ever arrived at the Academy, stories about crushing gravity and unpredictable predators, and a history soaked in conflict that most other species could barely comprehend. I had absorbed those stories the same way everyone else had, filing them away under the label Deathworlder, imagining something fierce and aggressive, something built primarily for violence. What I actually found, sitting across from Meera during our shared study sessions in the weeks that followed, was something far more complicated than that simple label had ever suggested. She was not fierce. She was not aggressive. If anything, she was one of the most patient, careful people I had ever met, someone who thought through every action before taking it and rarely raised her voice about anything at all. The violence I had expected to find in her, based on everything I had heard about her planet, simply was not there in any obvious way. What was there instead, hidden beneath that quiet, unhurried surface, was something I found far more unsettling the longer I understood it. A kind of stillness that never wavered, no matter what was happening around her. A calm that did not come from lacking fear, as she had told me herself weeks earlier, but from having learned, somewhere along the way, exactly how much of that fear needed to be shown at any given moment, and how much could simply be set aside until it was actually useful. I asked her about it directly, near the end of that term, during one of our last study sessions before final evaluations began. We were sitting on the observation deck, looking out at the trade world slowly rotating beneath the station, and I finally asked the question that had been building in me since the very first week of class. "Were you ever actually scared?" I asked, "when he pulled that blade?" She considered the question for a long moment, the way she considered most questions, turning it over carefully before answering. "For about half a second," she said finally. "Right before my body figured out what to do next. After that, there wasn't really time to be scared anymore. There was just the next thing that needed to happen." "How do you learn to do that?" I asked. "To just switch it off like that?" She shook her head slightly. "You don't switch it off," she said. "You just learn, eventually, that fear and action can happen at the same time, and that fear doesn't have to be the thing driving the car. Where I'm from, you learn that early, or you don't get the chance to learn it later." I did not fully understand what she meant by that until years afterward, long after I had graduated from the academy myself and gone on to serve alongside crews from a dozen different worlds, encountering my own share of dangerous situations along the way. It was only then, looking back on that conversation from the observation deck, that I finally understood the full weight of what she had been telling me. Earth had not produced a species built primarily for aggression, the way so many of us had assumed before we ever met a human in person. It had produced something far more specific, and in its own way, far more dangerous. A species that had learned, generation after generation, to function clearly and calmly in the exact moments when everything inside them was screaming to fall apart. That was the thing none of the old reports and rumors had ever quite captured. It was not the strength of a human bite force, or the speed of human reflexes, or even the raw physical toughness that so many species assumed defined a Deathworlder. It was that terrifying, unshakable calm, the ability to smile in the middle of the worst moment of someone else's life and simply finish the lesson, because somewhere beneath that calm surface, a part of them had already decided the outcome, long before the rest of the room had even finished catching up. I think about that Thursday afternoon often, even now, years later, whenever I find myself in a difficult situation of my own. I think about the way Meera looked at that blade coming toward her, and smiled, not because she wanted to hurt anyone, but because some deep, patient part of her had already solved the problem before the rest of us even understood there was one to solve. I never did find out exactly how bad things had to get on Earth, over all those thousands of years, to shape a person like that. Meera never talked much about her home, and I never felt it was my place to push her on it. But I have often wondered, in the years since, what would have happened that day if Dravith's attack had been faster, or sharper, or driven by something colder than wounded pride. I wondered what Meera would have looked like then, if the smile I saw that day was simply the calm end of the spectrum and not the only expression she was capable of. I hope I never find out, but some nights, remembering the stillness in her eyes as that blade came toward her. I am not entirely sure the rest of the galaxy will be so fortunate.